It's the fact we're burning those fossil fuels that is causing so many difficulties in so many ways. So if we're really serious about the security of our populations, then the faster we deal with getting off fossil fuels, the better the future is going to be.
We're here today with Simon Dalby, a very distinguished specialist in climate and security. And thank you very much for doing the interview, Simon.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Your work, as I understand it, falls between climate science and politics. So the climate scientists say, oh, this is what's happening, and the politicians are supposed to do something about it.
They are supposed to, and they have been very slow to respond.
Yeah. Okay, and your area is pointing out the dynamics and implications of environmental change on society.
And vice versa too. Society is of course key to driving environmental change.
An example of where environment affects real life, political issues, would be, say, where desertification and hard times in Africa puts greater pressure on immigration of African people into Europe, causing political problems.
And political problems have been highlighted with the boats trying to cross the Mediterranean, the attempts by numerous governments to intercept them, even criminalizing some of the people that are trying to actually help the migrants going across the Mediterranean. The political consequences of this are not pretty in Europe. They're certainly not pretty for the African migrants who are struggling to find a better life somehow or other. That said, there's an awful lot more than just climate change causing migration in the contemporary world. And one of the difficulties we have is teasing out, well, is there a particular bit that's just climate as opposed to the massive urbanization, the massive economic changes that are happening right across Africa.
And when we talk about teasing it out, it's what you're really pointing out there is saying to politicians and policymakers, this is what will be the effective action in this case, right?
If you deal with climate, you will reduce migration, therefore we will have less political difficulties.
Right.
That's the argument that's widely used. It's complicated because, well, it turns out that we're the ones causing most of the climate change, not the migrants that are set in motion. Usually we think about security, national security, as protecting our borders from foreign threats. But what's been really complicated is that actually we're the ones that are burning the fossil fuels, which is causing greenhouse gases, which is making climate change worse. So we actually have to rethink how we do things if we want to actually reduce many of the difficulties. They're also, of course, now beginning to bite big time in Europe as well. We're recording this in August of 2022. And, you know, in the last few weeks, the Loire River has basically turned into a series of puddles. It's not a river anymore. It will be as soon as the next major rainfall event hits France, obviously. But we're beginning to also see that the impacts are directly impacting our societies that are the fossil fuel generators. It's also getting even more complicated when you start thinking about environmental change and energy, because one of the problems the French in particular are having in the last few weeks is that with the rivers drying up, there's no cooling water for their nuclear power plants.
Oh my gosh.
And even where there is water in the rivers, because of the heat events of the last few weeks, the water is too hot to use to effectively cool the nukes that they are running. So we end up with a whole series of knock-on effects here, yes. Because if the nukes aren't running, the electricity isn't powering the air conditioners, which is making people more vulnerable to the heats, and all of these interconnections are what we now have to try and tease out if we're going to have effective policies and effective political action to deal with the climate crisis.
Science is, in your view, completely clear on the subject. Obviously, there are laymen who and a few scientists who say otherwise. It's like the Bible, isn't it? It's like the total volume of verbiage is maybe 1 million Bibles, and you can pick, in the same way as the Bible, you can pick and choose for anything to support whatever religion you want to have. You can pick and choose in science to get arguments against this. But your view is that the consensus is absolutely clear now.
There's absolutely clear. The science on this is basically the practice, and climate scientists are absolutely clear on this. There have been, over the last couple of decades, various people with PhDs in scientific disciplines who have been seen on camera repeatedly casting doubt about the consensus on this. But it's worth pointing out that very few of them are active researchers actually in the climate field. They're usually funded by somebody or other that is in a think tank, which indirectly are fossil fuel and industry funded. But, of course, one of the big problems we've had is that it makes a great story if you're a journalist, where you get on the one hand and on the other hand, and you put two people with conflicting views. Makes a great story for television, radio chat shows. It's easy. You just pose a few questions and let them argue, and then you've got a show. But that is balancing two things that are completely unequal, i.e. the consensus of science and a few outlier spokespeople that are willing to go on camera and say things and pass themselves off as experts.
You've got to stop using fossil fuels, and you use the term burning. What's the term used?
I use various terms relating to burn. Pyromaniacs and arsonists and various other things clearly apply.
We're just burning stuff. We've got to stop burning
We've
stuff.
got to stop burning stuff. And if we're going to solve climate change issues and all the political things that go with it, that's got to be the key focus. We've got to rapidly build an economy that doesn't require burning stuff to be prosperous. That's the challenge, and focusing on that challenge is what we all need to be doing.
Right. And the challenge is enormous, isn't it? The Paris Agreement, I'm going to put the graphic up to show this, but the Paris Agreement shows what has to happen to fossil fuels, and they've basically got to fall off a cliff.
Rapidly.
Tremendously. They've got to almost halved in 8 years now, or 7 years. It sounds remarkably challenging.
It is very challenging. On the other hand, it's urgent that we grapple with this. I think that the crisis in Europe in the last little while has made a lot of policymakers pay a lot of attention to this. If your rivers are drying up, Viking Cruises has had to cancel all of their river cruises for this summer because there's no water in the rivers. It's all these unlikely knock-on effects are beginning to get attention. And how do we do this? How do we have a prosperous Europe in this case? Well, we need to stop and think very, very hard about how we power all our technologies. It's been aggravated in the last few months. In 2022, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has got all tied up with the oil gas supplies from Russia to particularly Germany gets the headlines, but it's many other parts of Europe as well. If we sanction, i.e. NATO countries sanction Putin's Russia, well, he can always threaten to turn off the gas. And of course the big fear is that that's exactly what he will do this fall and through the winter, and leave a lot of very unhappy Germans in particular not able to heat their apartments. And hence of course the argument is that this may in fact unravel NATO support for Ukraine. And enforce some kind of deal with Putin, where the Ukrainians are simply forced to accept it, because the gas thing has caused so many problems in European politics. When you put that together with the climate discussion, of course, well, the point is that being dependent on that gas in the first place, whether it comes from Russia or not, is precisely the problem that's causing climate change.
So let's move on to talk about the security issues, which is your particular area. In the area of security, you made the point that fossil fuels generally have very long supply lines from all the way around the world, and long supply lines are a security threat. Not only could our supplies get cut easily, It also leads us to interfere in the affairs of other people too much. And that's an aspect that maybe you'd like to talk about, that aspect.
Yeah, the fuel crises that periodically hit Western nations usually have their origins at great distances, often in the Middle East. The current one, of course, is Russia because of the fears about gas being cut off. The point is that it's fuel. Fuel is substance that you have to get out of the ground somewhere, or you have to chop down some trees to burn it, usually at very considerable distance. Pipelines run across all the continents, in all sorts of strange places sometimes. And the tanker routes, of course, get our attention too. If one goes back to the 1950s in Europe, the gradual shift from coal to petroleum as a source was beginning to happen, funded at least in part by the Marshall Plan in the aftermath of the Second World War to reconstruct Europe. Oil was, the favoured fuel, not least because it was much less susceptible to industrial action. Coal miners could bring a society to a halt, as they occasionally did with major strikes. Much more difficult to do that with oil. It's still possible. And in 1956, the Suez Crisis generated all sorts of fuel shortage anxieties in Europe. Fast forward to the 1970s, and again, 1973, suddenly large parts of the world discovered that they were vulnerable to disruptions of supply or price increases in the aftermath of the October War in 1973 between Egypt and Syria and Israel, and the Arab countries got very upset with particularly Americans, but other countries as well, and disrupted supplies as a protest for the rearmament that was rapidly being done of Israel during that war. Then they suddenly discovered, wait a minute, we've got a lot of bargaining power and we can quadruple the oil prices and get a windfall out of this. And it's a lot more complicated than that, obviously, but that was basically the moment at which the OPEC crisis generated panic across the Western world, because suddenly dependency on oil became a real political issue. And we've been living with periodic crises on oil supplies ever since. Panic 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that North America was becoming completely dependent on Middle Eastern oil. Not true, but the panic was there, and part of the answer was actually fracking, which has all sorts of other spin-off effects, so that North American oil supplies were increased. Gas in particular as well increased, and so there was great celebration about energy independence in North America a few years ago. This supposedly allowed the Americans to do whatever the heck they wanted internationally, and they couldn't be held hostage to oil supplies. Of course, one of the nasty little consequences of fracking in particular has been methane leakage, which is aggravating our climate change problem now, because of course methane is one of the other greenhouse gases that is causing accelerated heating.
Terribly potent compared to carbon dioxide.
Over the short term, much more potent than carbon dioxide. Wait a few decades and its effect begins to dissipate, but we're in a crisis now, so all of these contradictions keep getting ourselves tangled up, but all of them come back to the fact that it's the fact we're burning those fossil fuels that is causing so many difficulties in so many ways. So if we're really serious about the security of our populations, then the faster we deal with getting off fossil fuels, the better the future is going to be.
And the point you're making in some of your writing is that solar and wind and even nuclear have very minimal supply lines. That they're not usually international as well. So much less potential for security problems.
The point is that they're not dependent on fuel. Well, I mean, nukes are, you do need to get uranium, and there are some supply chain issues with that. But in terms of solar and wind, once you've got the wind blowing through the blades of your aerogenerator, or whatever you want to call it, you don't have a fuel supply issue. Once you get the solar panels on your roof, again, there's no fuel. So once they're in place, yes, there's a few issues probably with spare parts, and every now and again a big windmill gets hit by lightning and spectacularly destructs, and a few other things happen. But again, you don't have to worry about the fuel tanker getting through. You don't have to worry about the politics the other side of the world once you've got that installed. And in that sense, if Europe was running entirely on solar power now, they wouldn't be worried about Russian gas. They wouldn't be worried about gas from anywhere, precisely because they have got lots of sunshine and wind.
Obviously, the security issue is a subset of the climate change problem. So we've got a situation where the climate is looks like it's there's an emergency happening with the climate, and some urgent action is needed, and security is part of the picture. That's also a threat. So let's move on now to the question of the politics and taking the actions at a global level. The nation state, again, you've written the reason why the Paris Accord is not United Nations taking action, it's all the nations taking actions, is because the nations themselves won't let anyone else tell them what to do. Right?
I mean, that's what sovereignty is all about. We're in charge within our boundaries is the basic assumption that nation states work on. Hence, the Paris Agreement is all about individual states providing what they call their nationally determined contributions. And they basically say, we're going to cut this much and we're going to cut that much and we will decide how it gets done. Given the fact that we live in a world of nation states, that's not unreasonable up to a point. But of course, it's not the whole story. My students were horrified when the Paris Agreement was signed. And they think, but Professor Dalby, it doesn't mention fossil fuels. No, it didn't mention fossil fuels. Trying to get them to realize that actually getting every state to agree we had a problem and to agree to at least a rough mechanism to begin tackling it was actually quite an accomplishment. And that wasn't going to convince students that this was a great idea, but it is indicative of just how far we've got to move and how fast we need to do it. Your point earlier about falling off the cliff is a matter of if we are going to get fossil fuel use reduced to the kind of levels that the Paris Agreement said would be relatively safe. There's still inevitably climate change baked into the system already, but relatively safe, then we need to dramatically reduce it. That's quite clear if you look at the science in terms of the accumulation of greenhouse gases. But trying to convince states to get their act together, trying to come up with mechanisms that everybody can agree on, trying to also allay the fears of some countries that don't want international inspectors poking around in the finer points of their economy, much less their politics. That was all very tricky, which is why the nationally determined contributions was key, that it was the nationally determined part of it that was crucial. But of course the mechanisms whereby you agree to how you count the greenhouse gases and whether states are living up to their obligations. And there's been endless debates about how to do that. And in fact, the annual meetings of the COP meetings that we hear about, the next one is in Egypt in November, are in many cases about just trying to get everybody to agree on the process and agree on how you count this stuff, agree how you evaluate it.
Sort of the administrative details rather than the substance.
So that everybody agrees that everybody is actually doing their bit. And this stuff's very complicated. I mean, the bigger question is whether this is in fact the mechanism we need to deal with this at all. If, for instance, the 5 CEOs of the big Canadian banks were to sit down in the Rideau Club in Ottawa or somewhere or other in Toronto and say, okay, look, we really do have a problem. We will all agree that we will not invest any more funds in further infrastructure for fossil fuels, further exploration or further extraction processes. They could actually make a big difference very quickly. Likewise, central banks could start leaning on other financial institutions to move their investments off new fossil fuel infrastructure. Central governments, regardless of the Paris process, could start ramping up the taxes on fossil fuels and simultaneously providing incentives for heat pump installations, for all sorts of vehicle fleet changes. We all hear about Teslas and EVs, but what about the big trucks? Moving the truck fleet quickly off gasoline and diesel particularly to I mean, those trucks are coming, but can we do infrastructure to make sure that the charging stations are provided, legislation to insist that that become an essential part of any highway development, or any municipality who wishes to put new infrastructure in has to include. These are the kinds of things we can do over and above what the Paris Agreement stipulates.
It sounds as though you don't have much confidence in the Paris Agreement to actually get us there. Would that be fair?
Given the fact that we need to move very quickly, the Paris Agreement is a very useful international contribution to all of this stuff, but it's not enough on its own. This emergency that we are dealing with requires changes in all parts of society, not just waiting around while government makes the rules. And I think for industry, particularly investment houses, the big banks, that's where we need to see initiative, because quite literally, what kind of future we are making depends on where those investment funds go. If they go into charging stations, if they go into electrical storage systems, whether it's big pumped hydro or small battery arrays or all the other new technology that's coming out, that is all going to move things along. It's going to make life a whole lot easier for the government bureaucrats trying to count the fossil fuel emissions, because clearly we will be dramatically reducing them regardless of what the regulations actually say.
Just because the technology is moving in that direction.
If you're using electric vehicles, not gas-powered vehicles, the emissions are going down.
There's an issue which I've read about and thought about a bit, which is the difference between planning to solve a problem and muddling through. There's the difference between, say for instance, a state-planned economy versus the messiness of a free market capitalist economy, which free market capitalist economy works a lot better, makes people richer and solves problems quicker. But as you've alluded to, there is a technology coming on stream that could solve the problem, make a huge dent in the problem anyway. And when you look at something that has to change, like the fossil fuels emission have to change so quickly in 8 to 10 years, they've got to halve. We've seen that many times in the past with adoption of new technology. Suddenly when something is cheaper and better, people just stop using the old thing. So there's a hope there. You can't plan on it because we don't know if the battery technology's breakthrough is going to happen.
You can't. I mean, the battery technologies have continued to become cheaper and more effective very quickly, partly because numerous corporations and numerous governments are incentivizing the research on this stuff. And this is a global issue that requires everybody to work on their particular piece of technology, and that includes corporations as well, who suddenly realize, wait a minute, there's money to be made with EVs and so on. And so the change comes rapidly. You can't sort of plan that in one sense. On the other hand, you can incentivize it, making sure that the charging structure infrastructure across the country is up and ready and running. You can probably legislate that. You can certainly push it in all sorts of ways. On the other hand, I mean, we have already moved to a substantial extent in Canada to get rid of coal. Powering past coal was one of the international initiatives, and even Alberta's power stations run on coal are being scheduled for closure. I can't remember exactly when, but is coming. And it's interesting to note that in Ontario, of course, they closed down the coal-powered stations a few decades ago, not for climate change reasons, but simply for air quality reasons. And so one of the other benefits of getting off fossil fuels is precisely that you reduce the number of premature deaths from pollution. The figure that's been kicked around these days is about 9 million people die prematurely every year from pollution from fossil fuels. If you can chop that in half even, well, we've improved lifetime and life expectancy for a lot of people.
That brings us on to the possibilities of geoengineering. You said some very interesting things to me about the way it could unroll. Because again, you'd think it would need a global initiative, but maybe it doesn't.
Well, the argument about geoengineering, there's numerous different forms of it. The one that gets most of the attention is, well, can we shade the planet? Can we actually inject some chemicals into the upper atmosphere, particularly into the stratosphere, because that's a stable layer above the lower atmosphere. And the assumption is if you put the chemicals up there, they stay there for a long time. If you put them into the lower atmosphere, every time you get a storm, I mean, it washes those things out. So it would have to be high up. So stratospheric aerosol injection, SAI, if you really want the technical term, it's called about half a dozen other things too. But really what it is a chemical shade for the planet. This is sometimes called the Pinatubo effect, because in 1991, the volcano in the Philippines blew its top, put a lot of sulfur dioxide and related chemicals into the upper atmosphere. And because by then scientists around the world were charting climate things and monitoring all sorts of attributes of the planet, it was quite clear that over the following couple of years, the planet cooled a little, simply because that stuff was lofted into the stratosphere. So everybody then says, well, what can we artificially do this? Of course, when that stuff finally falls out, you get more acid rain because it's sulfur dioxide, right? So then the question is, can we find something else? And one of the suggestions is if we're worried about oceans getting more acidic because of all the carbon dioxide we're putting in, then we might actually help a little if we used calcium carbonate, basically extremely finely ground up limestone, because it's alkaline, not acidic. So the argument is, well, can we inject that into the upper atmosphere? Yes, technically that wouldn't be all that difficult. There's all sorts of interesting ideas about using big guns to fire things into the stratosphere, balloons on tethers if you can pump the stuff up and disperse it. But the simple answer is probably simply high altitude planes. You'd sort of take crop dusting technology that we use in agriculture, just put a modified version of that on planes that can get into the stratosphere, and lots of jets can easily enough, and then simply fly them around, spilling this stuff out the back end of the planes, and we put ourselves a sun shield. Two huge problems, of course, three huge problems. I mean, first, who's going to decide to do this? Well, maybe the Chinese, fearing further huge heat events like they've been suffering this summer, might actually decide to do it. After all, they do use cloud seeding techniques to try to get it to rain on fields and not rain on parades in Beijing and so on. This is simply a scaled up version, isn't it? Kim Stanley Robinson's wonderful novel, The Ministry for the Future, which if you're interested in climate, you really do have to read. You just have to get through the first few pages. Is saying that the Indians will do this, because of course those first few pages in his novel suggests a huge heat event that kills huge numbers of people in India, a little bit worse than what India went through in March and April this year. But the scenario is, well, actually, we are suffering huge numbers of casualties from climate change. We are going to put this stuff in the stratosphere, whoever that we is. And the point is, it could be done cheaply, relatively speaking. You need a small fleet of aircraft flying 24/7. You need to put chemicals in that. I mean, we're talking about a few aircraft every day. Any serious industrial power can produce those kind of chemicals easily. So the real concern here is first of all, well, if one country decides to do it, what does that mean for international governance? In fact, I signed a petition a little while ago saying don't do it until we get some kind of global compact and agreement on the rules of the roads to do this, because of course it might go terribly wrong. And if it goes wrong, if it actually makes the monsoon even worse than the one that's hit Pakistan in the last few weeks, well, then there might be international accusations. Well, our floods that killed thousands and thousands of us and wrecked our economy were caused because you were putting this stuff into security implications again. And you've got security implications again. Yeah. If we do this, whoever that we is, whether it's the Pakistanis horrified by what's happening to their economy because of the current disruptions in the monsoon, it's just a very extreme version of it, then you've got the security consequences. If this has been running for a few years, and then as a result of agreement or maybe even a war to demolish the infrastructure that's doing this, then we suddenly have an extremely rapid cooling, a rapid warming, because the cooling effect has been removed. The so-called termination shock. Neil Stephenson's novel is called just that on this topic. then we have a rapid heating that makes everything actually worse. So the argument is that if you start doing it, you're going to have to keep doing it. And can we do this for decades, centuries? That's a dubious proposition, and these are the big questions that we're now starting to think about.
So basically, geoengineering isn't hard to imagine. It's doable.
It's doable.
It's doable, but my gosh, the risks are tremendous.
Huge. And at least in terms of the security dimension of this, one of the crucial things is that there are some basic international agreements on the rules of the road. Who's going to do what? Who's going to decide whether we need more or less, or whether we turn it off altogether? All of those questions need to be talked about, and frankly, in present circumstances, it's unlikely we're easily going to get that kind of international cooperation. Which brings us back to the security question. Yes. We've got to figure out, we as a community of 8 billion human beings, somehow we've got to get the institutions thinking seriously about these kind of really big questions, because we've never asked those kind of questions before.
And the Ukraine war, I was talking to Yves Tuberkian about that. The Ukraine war has, to some degree, polarized the world. There are some countries that are quietly expressing their distrust for us Westerners because of the things we've done in the past, and getting it all to come together is a big challenge. But it's clearly minds are getting focused, aren't they? The scientific minds, first of all, getting focused now in the area that you work in, of considering policy and implications like that. Minds are getting focused, and it's really for sure that the attention-grabbing events of this year have got the attention of the politicians and the populace.
And I mean, here in British Columbia last year was heat dome followed by atmospheric river. If that didn't get people's attention, I'm not quite clear what will, because clearly that killed hundreds of British Columbians. Clearly the infrastructure, particularly the Coquihalla, but also the railways, was simply washed out. Mm-hmm. Again, if we're worried about security in its various forms, both of those should really have focused our attention on this. Unfortunately, we are still in a province that talks about exporting natural gas, and we're still in a province which is fraught with controversies over pipeline building. So you know, we still have a long way to go, because clearly the point about climate change is infrastructure anywhere contributes to a common problem. If we are serious about climate change, pretending that we are simply reducing the emissions from the oil and gas industry without actually reducing their production is simply fudging the issue. And I think Canadians are finally beginning to realise this. Fascinating to note a young climate activist has thrown her hat into the ring in the NDP leadership race in this province. Hopefully that, well, she's probably not going to win, but hopefully that is going to get some of the senior bureaucrats in this province and the NDP politicians to suddenly realise that, wait a minute, we've got a generational politics here, because for those of us, you and I, may not live to see the second part of this century. It's highly unlikely any of us will, or either of us will, but the kids in high school and university can reasonably expect to be worrying about their pensions in 2070. And if we don't get a handle on fossil fuels soon, they're going to be living in a dramatically disrupted, very different world when they're worrying about their pensions. Ironically, the Greta Thunbergs of this world, on climate strike on Fridays around the world, they're the ones that have actually done their homework. So, that's her slogan. I mean, if you've done your homework, you realize a whole new way of thinking is necessary. She's been reading the climate science. Smart teenagers can read this stuff and realize, whoa, that's my future that's on the line.
Well, even if they're wrong about it, like young people are, in my personal experience, are often wrong about things that they're enthusiastic about.
They're not wrong about this one.
Even if they were wrong about it in some way or have inappropriate tactics, at least they're getting the attention. Right?
And the larger cultural shift that is required is part of what they're generating. getting the attention. Why are these kids doing this stupid climate strike? Shouldn't they be in school? Well, the point is they have been in school, and what they have learned, they realise that their future is up for grabs, and unless the folks with the white hair, you and me, our generation, actually get serious about it, they're in deep trouble when they get to be our age, if they get there. And that's what is absolutely crucial in terms of the generational politics of this. And it's not accidental that, you know, the climate activists that got involved in the NDP leadership struggle in British Columbia is in her 30s. They get it, the ones that are paying attention. And so this is another major issue in the politics of not only Canada but around the world, where youth activists have got a direct stake in getting fossil fuel use dramatically reduced and quickly. I think that what is absolutely crucial is that people recognise the urgency of this. This is not something that can be delayed. It needs to be dealt with. We're all part of one biosphere. We all need to pitch in on this. And those that have created the problem should be leading in terms of trying to clean up or make the solution and clean up the mess. In Canada, we are near the top of the per capita fossil fuel users, which means we're the ones that need to work hardest and quickest on dealing with this. And that requires a profound series of conversations about what kind of future are we making for our children and grandchildren, because the decisions that are made over the next decade or two will have profound implications. So that's an urgent discussion that needs to happen. But we need to be focusing on the next economy, on what comes next. Not being guilty about driving big trucks, not being guilty about what we've done in the past, recognizing it has consequences, and trying to design a better future, whether it has infrastructure for e-bikes, infrastructure to charge trucks, whether it requires us to think long and hard about what kind of public transport we put into our cities. All of those questions need urgent attention, and that's the key message. What we need to do in terms of security is secure our ability to adapt, our ability to change rapidly. That's been the opposite of what much of security has been about through the last 50, 70 years of NATO and the West. It's been about securing access to fuels. It's been about securing the modern economy that allows us to all live with all the lifestyle that we've become accustomed to. If that is to continue, what we really need to do is figure out how to move quickly so that we power our economies very differently. And security has to be about removing the roadblocks to those kind of rapid changes. That requires a mindset that's very different from traditional notions of national security, but we are stuck in this age of the Anthropocene, where human activities are changing dramatically how the planet works. And we've got to get that message through to policymakers and politicians and get the academics and the researchers and the students working on how to make those changes quickly. That's the agenda that now faces us all. And the sooner we recognize that and get on with it, the better.
Very good. Well, Simon, I think that's a natural point to conclude the interview.